Before I narrate the story of the convict Green, I'd like to caution you. This story is about extreme violence, robbery, torture, and murder. The rape and killing of a helpless little old lady is a little hard to take as well. The worst part of the story is it's true. So if you have a fear of being broken down on a lonely highway late at night and Satan in the form of a gang of depraved murderers finds you, then this is not the story for you. I'll also talk about the other killings these brutal beasts did in the days after. Terry Lee Green, registration number 80378-011, is currently serving his sentence at the ADX in Florence, Colorado. He's serving time for the state of Wyoming in federal custody for murder in the first degree, 2 counts. Attempted first degree murder, aggravated robbery, sexual assault, attempted second degree murder. When a state finds that they're unable to control an inmate, they contract with the Bureau of Prisons to house that inmate. For a fee, naturally. If you're a fan of this channel, you would have heard of Green before. I talked about the fight I had with him in the video called One Tough Prisoner. You can find it on my channel called As the Key Turns. As you watch this video, get my personal interactions with him. So that might be useful before you watch this. His being back in the Supermax prison is indicative of his proclivity for violent behavior. When I knew him, he was either a member or a very close associate of the most violent prison gang in the federal system, the Aryan Brotherhood. Just that one fact could account for his use of violence when I knew him and after. I've made several other videos about the Aryan Brotherhood and some of its members. You can find them on my channel too. The purpose of this video is to let you know the personality and type of convict Green is. Keeping in mind that everybody is an individual and there are types of personalities as well. Green is the type of convict that joins a criminal gang like the Aryan Brotherhood. A better understanding of Green is to understand this very dangerous criminal organization. As you listen to the story of Green, known by his prison nickname of the Beast, pay special attention to his total disregard for the well-being of others. No amount of pain or horror inflicted on others to save himself, even a minor inconvenience, is almost incomprehensible to the average citizen. For this reason, I don't expect to be believed. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. In this video and others, I'm giving you dates, times, and places, so you can check it out for yourself. This is the reason I give you inmate numbers. It gives you a head start on your own research. If you support me on Patreon, I release documents to my patrons at the $10 a month level. I also give them the book, As I Live and Breathe, by Dr. Marla Patterson, the retired chief psychologist of USP Marion when I retired from there in 2012. If this subject interests you and you would like to delve deeper into my stories, I'd encourage you to support my channel on Patreon. See the link below. Naturally, you're free to buy Dr. Patterson's books at Barnes & Noble or Amazon, and I highly recommend that you do. This whole thing starts on April the 16th, 1979, when Kevin Winston Osborne was sentenced in an Alabama circuit court to a 15-year prison sentence for robbery and grand larceny. He was sent to Staten, I guess it's pronounced Staten, correctional institution, and I know I'll murder this one too, Wepetumka, Alabama, I think is how you say it. He was placed on a work program which permitted him to walk out of the prison gates to a penitentiary facility which provided chicken and eggs for the institution. While on that program, it was prison authorities who discovered that there was a hold on him for another crime in another state. This meant he wasn't eligible for outside work privileges and he lost all of his good time. He was, therefore, advised that he could not leave the prison walls. Unfortunately, it seems that this message didn't get to the prison's guards at the gate. On November 21st, 1980, he escaped by just walking out as usual. and this time he just kept on going. He returned for he failed to return for the next count and was placed on escape status. Osborne then wandered from place to place. His only gainful employment consisted of odd jobs here and there, with 2 or 3 weeks on a fishing boat off the coast of Florida. After that, he bought a motorcycle and again took to the road. In Oklahoma City, he met up with Willard Eugene Teal, another escaped convict from a Texas prison. The pair rented a U-Haul truck and headed west. Then the pair went into Northern California, and somewhere along the side of the road on Highway 101, they picked up Terry Lee Green, who was then age 24, and Ellen Duncan. Ellen Duncan Hopkins was her name, and she was 18 years old. And they were hitchhiking together and, going nowhere in particular. Green was already a hardened criminal, and Hopkins was a New Orleans whore. The foursome wandered, across the western states into Wyoming on Interstate 80, arriving in Evanston, Uintah County, Wyoming, on the evening of May the 14th, 1982. Previously, the gang had stolen a credit card that they got by snatching some lady's purse. They drove to a motel where the whore Hopkins went in to register because the stolen credit card was in a woman's name. While she was checking in at the motel desk, the hardened criminal and 2 escaped prisoners waited in the cab of the U-Haul moving truck. Well, while the trio was sitting there, a drunk guy by the name of Jimmy Ray O'Brien came staggering by on the way to his room. The 3 men, watching him from the cab of the truck, came up with a plan to rob him. The scheme was that Hopkins, who had been arrested in New Orleans for prostitution, would pose as a hooker. Not much acting required there, and get into Mr. O'Brien's room, have sex with him while leaving the door unlocked, and the 3 would burst into the room, beat his ass, and take all his money and anything else they could steal. Evanston, at the time, was a booming center of activity because oil was discovered in the surrounding area known as the Overthrust Belt. The savages thought their victim was a well-paid oil worker and he'd have lots of cash on him. The whore called Mr. O'Brien's room and told him that she had seen him come in and thought he might be as lonely as she was and maybe they could spend the night together. After being invited over to his room, they talked for a while about horses and oil wells. She, according to the plan, was able to leave the door slightly open when she turned off the lights of the motel room. Soon after, the 3 men slammed the door open and rushed into the dark room. The lights were flipped on. Mr. O'Brien was on the bed only wearing a t-shirt. Hopkins, the whore, was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed. Green indignantly wanted to know what Mr. O'Brien was doing in bed with his sister. After this lie, Mr. O'Brien felt guilty and he was more easily subdued. Lying to a victim to get advantage is a common tactic of the Aryan Brotherhood. Mr. O'Brien's feet and hands were tied together, while Green was viciously beating him in the head and face. Mr. O'Brien with his fists. Teal was ransacking the room. Osborne became impatient with Green's failure to knock out O'Brien, so he picked up Mr. O'Brien's boots and, holding him in both hands, struck him several times on the temple. He did it with such tremendous force that blood splattered on the ceiling. After stealing $58.20, the only money that Mr. O'Brien had on him, Osborne took his eyeglasses and his boots. After the robbery and beating, the 4 left in the U-Haul, picking up their gear, throwing it into the truck, and got back onto Interstate 80, headed west with Osborne driving. Mr. O'Brien, left dying, broken, and bleeding on the bed, was not found until 1:30 the next afternoon in a coma. He was taken by ambulance to a Salt Lake City, Utah hospital where he died 2.5 months later on July the 30th, 1982, having never regained consciousness. The man slowly choked to death on the hospital on his own fluids because his body could not keep his lungs clear after the skull and brain injuries inflicted on him by Green and Osborne. The later autopsy or testimony of the Utah State Medical Examiner, a forensic pathologist who supervised the autopsy, was that in his opinion, Mr. O'Brien died of, quote, superlative bronchopneumonia secondary to blunt force injury to the head, unquote. The point of injury was on the right side of the head, a large defect about 2.5 inches in diameter just above the ear. As a result of the blows, the skull was fractured with bone fragments driven into the brain. During the attempt to save Mr. O'Brien's life, the scalp was cut open in order to remove the bone fragments. The incision revealed evidence of massive bleeding as well as bruising of the brain. The nature of the injury was consistent with the head having been beaten with a boot. After stealing $58.20, the only money Mr. O'Brien had, Osborne took his eyeglasses and boots. After the robbery and beating, the four left in the U-Haul pickup truck with their own gear and flung it in the truck and got back on Interstate 80, heading east with Osborne driving. Mr. O'Brien, left dying, broken, and bleeding on the bed, was not found until 1:30 the next afternoon in a coma. He was taken by ambulance to a Salt Lake City hospital where he died 2.5 months later on July the 30th, 1982. He had never regained consciousness. The man slowly choked to death in the hospital on his own fluids because his body could not keep his lungs clear after his skull and brain injuries inflicted on him by Green and Osborne. Later testimony of the Utah State Medical Examiner, a forensic pathologist who supervised the autopsy, was that in his opinion, Mr. O'Brien died of suppurative bronchopneumonia secondary to blunt force injury to the head, unquote. The point of injury was on the right side of the head, a large defect about 2.5 inches in diameter of the skull just above the ear, so like right in here. As a result of the blows, the skull was fractured with bone fragments driven into the brain. During the attempt to save Mr. O'Brien's life, the scalp was cut open in order to remove the bone fragments. The incision revealed evidence of massive bleeding as well as bruising of the brain. The nature of the injury was consistent with the head having been beaten with a boot. The medical examiner further testified that bronchopneumonia is a common complication of head injuries. When a person is in a comatose condition for a long period of time, he's bedridden, his breathing is impaired, his entire body's constitution is depressed, pneumonia develops and the patient dies. However, the cause of death was the actual blow to the head. When the escaped prisoner Osborne, the hardened criminal Green, the other escaped prisoner Teal, and the whore Hopkins left Evanston about midnight of May the 14th, 1982, they went east and crossed over into Sweetwater County, Wyoming, about 8 miles west of Little America, an elaborate, expansive motel, restaurant, and truck stop complex along US 80. They came upon Dale Moore, age 38, a school teacher of Surrey, British Columbia, Canada, standing alongside his disabled vehicle with the hood up. Osborne was driving a U-Haul truck and stopped, got out, went over to Mr. Moore and offered to help. Mr. Moore first asked Osborne to stop at Little America and send out the AAA tow truck. Osborne talked him out of the idea. Although nervous about it, Moore accepted Osborne's offer of a ride to take him to Little America. This was the decision that sealed Mr. Moore and his aged mother's fate. When I was a kid, I always liked to go to Little America because of the restaurant and video game machines they had there back in the 70s. Wyoming is a long and empty drive even now, and a distraction now and then was welcome when I was a youngster. Mr. Moore then went back to the disabled vehicle to tell his mother, Audrey Ditmars, age 60, that he was leaving with 3 men and the woman. Mr. Moore and his mother were pulling a 12-foot U-Haul trailer from Santa Cruz, California to her new home in Missouri Valley, Iowa, when the car broke down on the deserted stretch of road. Mr. Moore told his mother to roll up the windows, lock herself in, and not get out of the car. When Mr. Moore and Osborne went back to the truck, the 3 others were in the cab. Mr. Moore was told the cab was full and he'd have to ride in the back of the truck. Mr. Moore got in the back of the U-Haul and the criminals locked him in, leaving no escape. As the truck went on down the road, the gang of killers in the cab started making plans to rob Mr. Moore, but decided they had better go back and pick up Moore's mother first. They stopped to gas up the truck at a roadside station, then turned around and returned to the Moore's broken down car. Before returning to Mr. Moore's vehicle and trailer, they pulled off the interstate onto a graveled side road. Mr. Moore, still locked in the back of the moving truck, was unable to see what was going on. He began to suspect he was in real trouble. It became clear to Mr. Moore that they should have been at Little America by now. Along with the stopping, turning, and backtracking, he realized that he was going to be robbed or worse. He had several $100s in cash with him in order to get his mother established. With a bad feeling, he removed the money from his wallet and placed it in various pockets and hid it as best he could in his clothing. When the truck stopped on the gravel road, Osborne opened up the back doors and said, quote, "Okay, get out." When Moore looked down, he saw they were in an isolated area in the middle of the desert. "What's happening?" asked Mr. Moore, to which Osborne replied, "It's a robbery." Then held a knife to Moore's head and eyes and said, "Close those fucking eyes before I cut them out." Mr. Moore became cooperative and told him to take the money and begged that, he get released. "I got a wife and kids." He repeatedly pleaded with the killers for his life. Osborne told the rest of the gang what to do. Mr. Moore was laid down, his pants legs were torn to make ropes out of. His feet and hands were tied, the contents of his clothing were emptied into a sack, and somebody's dirty stock was stuffed into his mouth. He said in court, quote, "Tasted like it'd been worn for days," unquote. Mr. Moore was not sure of who, but one of the gang stayed in the back of the truck and the doors were locked shut. The truck then proceeded back down the highway and then west to Mr. Moore's disabled car. After the truck stopped, Mr. Moore was able to recognize the sound of his mother's car door being opened and slammed shut. Mrs. Ditmars was told that her son had been left at the motel and they were to take her there to greet him. Mrs. Ditmars got in the truck with a gang of murderers. Green turned up the radio very loud so she couldn't hear any movement that might be taking place in the truck box. Mrs. Ditmars was seated in the truck cab with Hopkins the whore, Osborne the escaped convict, and somebody else. One of the gang stayed in the boxed truck with Mr. Moore to keep him quiet or from escaping or trying to make any noise. They drove the truck a short distance and stopped on the side of the highway. Mrs. Ditmars was roughly put in the back of the truck as another captive. Mr. Moore could hear, but he couldn't see what occurred, as he was afraid to open his eyes and he didn't want to create an excuse for the gang to kill him. He heard his mother scream after she was brought in. He sat up and asked, "Hey, what are you doing?" He was stomped 5 or 6 times violently on the back of his head and neck. One eye, as a result, was completely swollen shut. He was right next to his mom when Green, age 24, raped a 60-year-old lady with Osborne laughing and cheering him on. After the vicious rape of the old lady, someone said to cover her up, and the truck was again driven back onto the road. One of the gang guarding the 2 beaten half-to-death victims who were locked in the back of the U-Haul truck. During the drive in the cab, Osborne said, "We're going to have to kill him." So it was decided Terry Green would do it. They stopped, and the men went to the back of the truck. Hopkins, the whore, stayed in the cab, but heard struggling and Mrs. Ditmars screaming, "Please, no!" Mr. Moore, in the truck box, heard sounds of exertion like someone lifting a weight, then a faint gurgle or gasp. One of the killers said, "She's a tough old bird." Osborne said, "The next one's yours." Later, Moore heard his mother's bowels let go as she died in a pool of her own blood. Green grabbed Moore by the back of his wool shirt and took a slice at his neck with a knife, but because of the heavy wool shirt and the gag, the first slash or two only cut the material. Green kept viciously slashing at his throat till blood began to gush from the cut. It was about 3 inches long. Mr. Moore made a gasp and went limp in an attempt to fake his death. Mr. Moore was securely tied this time, feet together and hands behind his back, hands and feet then cinched together in a manner we call hogtied. His mother's killers got out of the box of the truck, closed and locked the doors, and went to the cab. All three of the animals were covered in fresh blood from head to toe. They drove off looking for a place to dump the dead bodies of their 2 victims. They were all rejoicing and bragging about what they had just done, celebrating and laughing about raping a helpless old lady and stomping her school teacher's son half to death, then cutting his throat, killing the 2 victims with a knife and their bare hands as they lay helpless and tied while injured from the beatings was all just a big joke to the 4 of them. The truck was driven to a deserted, lonely, windswept gravel trail near Point of Rocks, Wyoming, in Sweetwater County. They stopped at a spot that was totally deserted of human habitation. A place you could scream for as long and as loud as you could, and nobody would ever hear a thing. The landscape of that chosen place had not changed in 10,000 years. While the truck was underway, Mr. Moore was able to free himself. He used some cloth to slow the bleeding from the gash in his throat. His mother was dead, and her blood was a huge pool, causing everything to be wet and slippery. Mr. Moore found his shoes and put them on, and decided when the door was opened he was going to run for it. He had no weapons, he was badly injured, and had lost a lot of blood. He had never had to fight a gang of killers as a school teacher, but he was determined to do the best he could to survive. He waited in the dark in the truck. When the vehicle stopped and the doors were flung open, Mr. Moore saw the dawn was breaking, and behind the truck a vast landscape of sagebrush-covered wasteland. He threw a bottle of shampoo he had found at the man who had killed and raped his mother, then jumped out of the truck, swinging a shoe fastened to the end of a pistol belt. He took off down the road as fast as he could, with Green in hot pursuit. With Green hot on his heels, then he ran into the sagebrush on the side of the deserted trail. He was weak and sick from blood loss. He became dizzy with the exertion of the running, stumbled and fell. Lying on the ground, he curled up, hands around his head in a futile attempt to protect himself, when Green started viciously stabbing him in the back. Green stabbed him 15 times as hard as he could. Mr. Moore tried the old gasp and go limp trick again, hoping against all hope that the stabbing would stop. It stopped. He was dragged through the brush into a hollow where he was thrown onto his back. With his eyes open, he pretended that he was dead. Some grass, dirt, and sagebrush was flung over him. Mr. Moore heard them throw his mother's corpse from the truck, which hit the ground with a thud. He then heard the truck driving off. The killers tried to clean up all the blood in the truck by throwing dirt on it and then sweeping it out a few times. I should make it clear here that Mr. Moore is an ordinary man, had been beaten and mercilessly stabbed by Green and his friends. The 3 men of the gang were very large and strong men. I saw Green in prison 15 years later assault 20 prison guards armed with riot batons. He almost escaped the cell block after being shot in the crotch with a rubber bullet round from an anti-riot gun. To say Mr. Moore was not going to win a fight with them is an understatement. I doubt Joe Louis could have won a fight that night with those killers on that deserted road. When the truck was gone, Mr. Moore somehow got to his feet. The sun was just coming up in the arid landscape of sagebrush and rolling hills. Far off in the distance, he could see the lights of a building of some kind. He staggered like a drunk toward it, fell, crawled through a ditch, had a small creek in it, and across the railroad tracks, through a barbed wire fences and across the highway, and finally collapsed in the driveway of a gas station. A short time later, his broken and bloody body was found by a shocked employee who called the cops and covered him with a blanket. Mr. Moore told the horror-stricken attendant what had happened to him. He wanted to tell the story because he was afraid he'd die before the cops arrived. He lived long enough to testify against the animals who raped and killed his mother and tried their very best to kill him. Mr. Moore was able to identify only Osborne in court. He was unable to identify his other attackers. Mr. Moore's ability to only identify Osborne is understandable because Osborne was the one who first approached him on the highway offering help. He only saw the others while they were in the dark on the side of a lonely highway in the middle of the moonless desert night. I can tell you from experience that a Wyoming night can be so dark you can't see your own hand right in front of you. In court, the 18-year-old whore said Osborne was the undisputed leader of this gang of outlaws. He was able to whip up into a frenzy the others like a school of sharks in a feeding frenzy. A deputy sheriff found Audrey Ditmar's dead body in the desert. The corpse face still had the horror of being raped, strangled, and hacked to death on it. This night of indescribable depravity was only prosecuted because Mr. Moore's description of the U-Haul truck and its occupants. The broadcasts of media radio news that led the cops to apprehend the gang of real-life ghouls in Laramie, Wyoming, about 175 miles east of Point of Rock, the scene of the crime. If there's a postscript to this story, it might be this. Osborne was rightfully sentenced to death for his crimes. He will never be put to death because our courts, in their infinite wisdom, sees fit to let him live his worthless life out behind prison walls. Green, the killer and raper of helpless old ladies, lives a full life on your dime in federal prison. I know. Like I said, I made a video about him. I know him. The whore was set free decades ago, having served her 4 years for her part in luring victims to their death. It's hard to get a jury to convict a young and pretty girl. People think if you're attractive, you must also be nice. That's what makes attractive people effective serial killers. Then there is the natural nativete of Americans who believe that people are basically good. Most people stupidly think that everybody has some good in them. I'm here to testify that there are inhuman beasts that walk this earth with no concept of love or mercy. They are dead inside and only live to bring pain and misery to others in the most horrific way possible. God help you if you happen to be found on a deserted road by one of them, as these victims were. The other killer? Green strangled to death in his county jail cell to keep him from testifying against him in court. It wasn't a pleasant death. It takes a very tight and painful pressure for 15 or 20 minutes on a man's throat to kill him. At least that's been my experience in prison. Green rightfully believes that dead men tell no tales. If there's such a thing as ghosts, then that poor old lady must scream for justice on cold moonless nights out there on that lonely stretch of gravel trail not far from Interstate 80. I really hope her soul is at rest and not walking the frozen high desert after what Green did to her.